with LA burning down, I am reminded of my parents and my friends always encouraging me to buy a home, because for the longest time, I have always been against buying a home after learning about the dark side of home ownership. Now imagine this, you are in a state where you buy a home and you cannot insure it. So far that seems to be only specific to California, where insurers just don't want to work in California because there's no profit in it. Between 2020 and 2022, apparently 2.8 million homes lost their insurance because the insurers, they said, we don't want to do business here because we can't make a profit. And 500,000 of those homes were in LA. So I was reading the news a lot when it came to the fires, and one homeowner, he had his insurance raised from $4,500 one year to the renewal offer being like $18,000. So obviously he wasn't able to pay for that, and he decided to go bare. What that means is he decided to forego insurance. And unfortunately, what happened was during the fires, his house burned down. So the man literally lost everything. So we'll talk more about that later. So I think that California is only the first of many major events that will be like this in the future. And here's my take. I really love California. It's a beautiful place. I went up there last December for a health retreat to take a closer inspection of how I could fix my prostate issues. And during that time, I rented a car to go and do some hikes, and it was amazing. But in renting the car and eating out in California, I took a look at the taxes and I puked. The policies that politicians make for California are just terrible. And I did some quick research after I came home, and I found that California spent $24 billion on homelessness since 2019. And so far, it seems like homelessness has just increased. So this is a case where throwing money at a problem only exacerbated and increased the problem. Like, what the heck are they doing? How can you be throwing money at the problem and the problem gets worse? There is another thing with high-speed rail. The projected cost of that is going to be around 89 to 128 billion. And that project has been going on since apparently 2008, where voters approved 33 billion. So it's been since 2008. Okay, and then you take a look at the 22 billion spent for benefits and services on illegal immigrants. Now, let me just put it out there, I have no qualms about immigrants. They just gotta come in legally, because I'm an immigrant, and the only way I could come in and go after the opportunities in America was because I came in legally. I don't expect handouts, especially when that money spent could be spent on veterans who fought to protect the country, fought to protect my freedoms. So spending 22 billions on people who, frankly, I'm just gonna say don't deserve it, that's a slap in the face. Californians pay the highest tax in the country, and to me, seemingly, it seems like they really get nothing in return whatsoever. In addition to that, with the fires, the insurance premiums are just gonna go up, and additional living expenses, which are, as I've learned, the insurance that you get in case your house burned down for you to use for hotel stays, that is not gonna be enough, and that is not going to last long enough. And sadly, people with mortgages, even though their house burned down, they're still gonna have to continue paying those mortgages. So that's the dark side of home ownership. In California specifically, I really think we live in a very unique world today, because unlike the 90s, every single country that can print money is printing money. So unlike the 90s when my parents can just go to Vancouver and they were like, we like it here, we're gonna buy a home here. They can buy a home without having to worry about government policies that might prevent them from getting their home insured. So it feels like I really have to be aware of what the government is doing and the policies they're making, because in this day and age, it seems to be getting more and more extreme, which makes it more and more terrifying. Quite frankly, it feels like the government is just not for you anymore when you elected them so that they can make the decisions that will be the best for you, that will be more beneficial for you. Right now, it feels like elected officials are there only to line their own pockets, and that they will do that at the expense of you, the voter who voted them into office, for your benefit. So it really feels like the people that you elect conspires against you. So when you are born from the womb to a Chinese household, there are expectations for success. You know, the first expectation is you are expected to become a doctor or a lawyer. And I think it's only just this past 2 decades where they added software engineers into that list. So I wasn't able to meet expectations. I just kind of gradually wiggled my way into expectations. And the second expectation for success is they expect you to own a home. That is the model. That is 100% what you should strive for. If you want to get married, you better have a home. In my last video, why I think first-generation Asians are modern slaves. My parents immigrated from Hong Kong to Canada for better opportunities. They grew up in the neighborhood of Sham Soi Po, so they told me that that was the poorest neighborhood. But according to comments from my past YouTube videos, because I mentioned it before, that's like the second poorest neighborhood or something. I'm not sure, so I'm just going off their stories about it. So at the same time, HK during the 70s, they were growing economically. So they were growing fast. And the problem with that is when you have money flowing into a city, the income inequality grows. So the life of the poor basically gets harder and the life of the rich just gets better. So I imagine during that point, my parents and her parents and siblings literally just sitting around the dinner table trying to make a decision whether to move to Canada or not. My mom used to tell me stories of how she grew up in basically a room that was 600 square foot. So you would think that is big, right? But that is only for yourself. So she was sharing that room with all her siblings and her parents. So 7 people stuffed into a 600 square foot room. It's not a lot of space. Now, on top of that, imagine that you have 10 other families in this apartment in the same situation. And on top of that, imagine that you have to share communal bathrooms with those 10 other families. It's not very sanitary. It's very poor living. And mom used to tell me that she was basically doing her homework on staircases because there just wasn't any room at home. You know, 600 square foot, 7 people, can't do much with that. On top of that, if you want to get good work done, you need some quiet place where you can think deeply. And when you're in a room with 7 other people all doing their own thing, that's very unlikely. So she used to do her homework on the staircases because that was the only place she could find where she could find quiet and peace to do her homework. So when you're thinking about owning a home, that was out of the question. That was a pipe dream. So where they were is they were trapped. Grandma starts describing how one of her coworkers quit and left the country, went to Canada for better opportunities, and she started making questions, or started asking questions, started wondering, started dreaming. You know, if this is the best life I can give my kids, a cramped room for 7 kids, a couple of my kids that have to go and do their homework in the staircases, what kind of lives would my grandchildren have to live? Do I want my grandchildren to do the same thing as my child right now, where I have to have her help me make clothes in order to help the family survive? Because that's what my mom did. My mom told me that when she was growing up, she didn't get a lot of sleep because she had to go and help her mom sew clothes in order to survive, in order to put food on the table. So she was always malnourished and always lacking sleep. And when it comes to growing children, one of the most important things that children need is proper sleep. For kids to grow up well and learn, you can't have them work late hours. They need to get their sleep. But because they were in such a desperate situation, that wasn't an opportunity. That wasn't an option. So they had two choices to make: stay in Hong Kong and live trapped, or risk it and go to Canada to see if the rumored opportunities are true. For anyone in life, I think that life is not easy. Life is hard, but living life without hope, that is impossible. So there was no hope in Hong Kong. That's what I think Grandma and Grandpa thought. So I think that they saw that and they knew that the best decision was to save up and then pack it up and leave for Canada, which is what they did. So the decision to take the risk and move to Canada was the biggest risk ever. And it was a risk that paid off for my parents, because in Hong Kong, there was no way that they were ever going to buy a home. But when they moved to Canada, every single one of my aunts and uncles and my parents, every single one of them owns their own home. Nobody rented from nobody. But when it came to the children, my cousins and I, we're unable to do that. We are all born in Canada. We all live in Vancouver. And by the time we became adults, we were unable to buy our own home, because what happened in Hong Kong happened in Vancouver as well. Money came in, income inequality grew, and the prices of homes just skyrocketed while the wages stayed the same. There was no way any of us could buy a home. And not only my aunts and uncles, my parents, but even my grandma, who did not believe she would ever own a home, was able to buy one in Vancouver and have it completely paid off. The really sad part is that she died without a will, which caused a fight between all the siblings. And if you're nosy and curious about what happened, check this video out right here, because let's just say due to that, the family completely broke apart. They don't talk to each other anymore. And if you're a first generation Asian born to an immigrant family, then the likelihood is your family is probably the same as mine. They place a high value on home ownership. For my parents specifically, they have the mindset that when it comes to home prices, it can only go up. It can never go down. And every single time, I disagree with that thinking. We just saw what happened to California, right? The home prices, after everything burned down, it's not high now. When I disagree with them, all I can see is contempt in their eyes. And I could see what they're thinking, even though they don't want to say it. They're thinking, oh great, we raised a dumbass. So I've always been the dark sheep. I've always struggled to talk about why I don't want to own a home to my friends, because they can't see it from my perspective. I'd much rather own a YouTube channel, build that YouTube channel, and own Bitcoin. But of course, you can't say that, because even if you don't say that, I find you can see it in their faces. They think, why do you want to own magic internet money? That's stupid, Donald. You're a dumbass. And even after Bitcoin climbs up to 105K, they will still think the same thing. Like I said before, I think that many traditional Asian families think that homes are the ultimate investment and that prices can never fall. My parents definitely thought and still think of it as the same way. You know, when we're talking about natural disasters, Vancouver is in high risk earthquake areas, but my parents think that, you know, that can never happen to us. And I think that in LA, a lot of people thought the same thing. They thought, we have wildfire risk, but I don't think that can ever happen to us. But you know, I always followed the belief that just because it hasn't happened to you yet doesn't mean it will ever happen. So I love taking you guys on walks, but it is 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -3 Celsius outside, so I couldn't bear it. I had to come back in. But I was really curious, so I looked up the home prices of the Pacific Palisades, you know, the area that got burned down, and I found out that the median home price was $4.7 million. I was really keeping up with the fire when it happened, because I was really curious about how much this whole thing was gonna cost and how much the total rebuilds were gonna be. And I found out in the Iced Coffee Hour when they did a podcast with Meet Kevin, and it turns out that 69.4% of the insurance policies were dropped. And there's this guy called Francis Bichetti. He was one of them, and I mentioned him earlier in this video. He was a guy where his insurance policy was $4,500 per year 1 year, and then farmers insurance, I believe, raised it to $18,000 per year. So obviously he couldn't afford it. But luckily, California has this insurance policy called the FAIR Plan that only insures you up to like $3 million of your house or something. So when it comes to Pacific Palisades, $4.7 million is the medium home price. So you're short 1.7 million at least. And I really feel for Francis, because who can afford an insurance increase of 4x? Let's say that the price that I'm paying to rent my place right now is $1,800. If it's 4x, then that will mean I will end up paying $7,200. At that price, I'd be on the street. I'd be out there freezing my butt off. Now for Francis, there was the FAIR Plan, like I said, but it had really strict requirements. Apparently for the FAIR Plan, they required him to cut down like 10 trees or something. And after doing the cost analysis of that, he couldn't afford cutting off those 10 trees as well. So his decision at the end of the day, since he couldn't pay the insurance from farmers, he couldn't pay to meet requirements for the FAIR Plan, he decided to go bare, which means that he's not gonna have insurance. And as we know it, at the end of the story, his house burned down and now he has nothing. And I imagine that being my aunts and uncles and my parents, because they're all sitting on Vancouver property valued between $1.5 million to $2 million. And they always ask me whenever I go back home to visit, whether I'm going to come back to Vancouver to live here again. So the reason I don't live in Vancouver isn't because I don't like it. Vancouver is great. There's a lot of food options and there's a lot of outdoor things to do. I just don't like that it rains all the time. The taxes are super high, and even though you pay so much taxes, the city still looks like it's going on into the dumps. I remember coming back to Vancouver this past October in 2024. 20 minutes off, stepping off the airplane and going on the SkyTrain, I noticed that one end of the cart was just full of homeless just sleeping there. They were all drenched and they smelled terribly. And then the other part of the cart were all the people that didn't want to be near them. So back in the 90s, you just didn't see this sort of stuff. So if it was Vancouver back in the 90s, 100% would have considered it, but now it's 100% not gonna go back. I mean, I've already seen this when I was in my early 20s when I just started my career. Back then, I already noticed that the wages were stagnant, but the home prices kept going up. I realized immediately then that there was no way that I'm ever gonna be able to own a home in Vancouver. You know, by the time that I left high school, my parents were already bragging how their home was shooting up in value across the $1 million mark. And I'm thinking, that is something that I have to work an entire lifetime to earn. And to give you a real sense of it, my parents bought the house that they currently live in, the one that my brother and I were raised in 95, for around $270,000. And by the time it was 2013, 2014, it was hovering around $1 million. That's incredible appreciation. And to top it off, there's just too much risk when it comes to living in Vancouver. I mean, like LA with the wildfire risk, Vancouver sits on top of tectonic plates in what I believe is the Pacific Rim, which means that there's higher chances of earthquakes. So wherever I move to, I find that I get asked about home ownership there, like it's a cult. I remember when I lived in Virginia, I have a lot of friends in Virginia and the DMV area. And I remember that they asked me whether I was going to consider buying a home in Virginia. I thought, maybe, until I looked on Zillow and found that, prices of homes in Northern Virginia are like $600,000 to $700,000. And then whenever I go and have dinner with them at their houses, they would talk about all the maintenance and upgrades that they're doing to their homes, or they would complain about property taxes and home insurance, or they would talk about how quickly their home values appreciated, because I remember a lot of them basically bought right before COVID happened. They got really great interest rates. That means that they've also handcuffed themselves to the place because of that interest rate. And then after COVID, they see the value of their house just skyrocket, due to inflation and money printing. And they would brag about that. They would brag about how much their homes are worth now. And as they're telling me this, I'm thinking, okay, so you've trapped yourself in one state and you gave up the freedom to move around in the US, and that you're spending your after-tax money to do maintenance and upgrades to your house, which I get it, you have to do maintenance, but when you do those things, you're also spending after-tax money and you're also paying taxes again. And you're also spending money to buy insurance to protect your house, and every single year you have to pay property tax to the government for your property, which me as a renter, I don't have to pay any taxes for property because I'm not the landlord. And now you're bragging about the increase in your home value, but you can't have any access to that money unless you sell the property. So in essence, it's just paper money. It's monopoly money. Maybe I'm crazy, but all in all, that doesn't really make any sense to me at all. You know, I have to make clear that I'm not against home ownership at all. I think there's a time and place to buy a home. And that specifically to me is when you are getting married or you're thinking of starting a family. Like my parents did not buy a home until my little brother, who was 4 years younger than me, was about to be born. So we lived in Richmond, British Columbia for the first 3 years of my life, right? And my parents rented when they first started their family. I kind of remember because my memory wasn't formed back then, but I remember us moving out of Richmond and coming into Vancouver. And I remember my mom crashed with my aunt and her husband, and back then they had 2 kids. They had their daughter, who's the same age as me, and they just had their son, who's 2 years younger. And it was around that time, you know, we were age 4 years old, and we just crashed at my aunt's basement on top of a futon. And that was a freaking party, and not long after, my parents found and bought our current home, which we've been living at for the past 30 plus years. So right now, a lot of my homeowner friends, they're actually single, and they live in metropolitan cities like Vancouver, Dallas, Toronto, Montreal, really big cities. And I don't know about you, but I find that dating in big cities really suck. I've always thought, all right, what happens if you meet a girl within the same city or in a different city and things get serious and you both own a place? Then you have to come to the decision of who is going to move. And I always feel that the one person that has to sell their place is getting the short end of the stick. It's unfair for them to sell their place in order to move into the place of the person that they're eventually gonna marry. And if that doesn't work out, then you just spent a lot of time going through a process to find yourself in a place where you don't want to be. I think it's much better for, you know, 2 people who are going to build a life together to decide together where they're going to live, where they want to raise their kids, and how they want their lives to be. But if you're already set up with a home, that conversation gets much more difficult because I think you're invested in that house, you're invested in that community, and if you're gonna move for the other person, you're just gonna have to give that all up, or it's vice versa for the other person as well. And I think there's something that was taught in church today, and it's something that I've been thinking of. You know how before marriage, the couple usually lives apart, and my pastor was really like, all right, you guys really shouldn't live together before marriage to avoid temptations. And I think that you can kind of use the same argument here, that a home is something that both partners, both parties should decide on, because at that point when they're joined together, they are now building their lives together. So yeah, that is something that I haven't thought completely through, but it's been something that's been on my mind a lot. So I have this story of 2 friends that were dating, and the guy already had his house prior to him dating the girl. So they decided that she was going to move into his house. Now, I had a feeling in the back of my mind that their relationship was not gonna last forever because they didn't have a shared goal in mind. You know, both of them didn't want kids, and marriage wasn't talked about. So I think the unspoken truth was, we're not gonna get married. So at that point, what in the world are you dating for? Just to have roommates? That was something that always popped in the back of my mind. But the problem is that the guy owned the home. He already had a life before the home, and he invited her to move in and told her that, you know, my home is your home, but her name was not on the title. So I have a feeling that she never considered that her home. Whenever they have arguments, whenever they have disagreements, I feel that she never had anywhere to run to because that place was foreign for her. It was never her home. She was actually paying rent to her ex-boyfriend for the right to live there. Things didn't work out. They ended up having a really bad breakup that affected everyone around them. And at the end of the day, they now return from work back home to an empty home with nobody saying "Okaeri nasai," which is what you see in anime. So that's the dark side I see in homeownership. And while it sucked that the LA fires ravaged and tore up LA, that the estimated cost of rebuild is going to be $130 to $150 billion, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe there was someone out there working a dead-end job, returning to an empty home where nobody is welcoming them back home. That's me right now. And maybe that fire is the start of someone finding their freedom. And maybe if they're single, finding a partner that they can build together with from the foundations and to decide where they want to live, where they want to raise kids, not bringing in the problem of, all right, I already have a home. Do you want to move in? And don't worry, this home is going to be your home, but you're not going to feel like it's your home. Is that something that we want? So those are questions that I thought about while I was making this video. And I'm interested to know, what are your thoughts as well? Let me know in the comments. And if you're curious and you enjoyed this video, check out this video that I made right here.